Good evening, everyone, and thank you for joining us for this discussion of All We've Got. I'm Elizabeth Goldstein. I'm the president of the Municipal Art Society, and we're delighted to have this dialogue this evening with Alexis Clements and Shawn Smith-Cruz. Before I introduce them, I want to share a few tips on our format this evening and the platform that we're using. This discussion will run approximately an hour long and is being recorded. We have pinned the panelists' videos to your screen and have muted all video and audio for attendees during this discussion to avoid background noise and feedback. Please ask your questions in the chat box, which is to the upper right-hand corner of your screen. And throughout the program, I'm going to call on audience members to ask your questions. And we can unmute the audio so you can be part of the conversation and ask directly. Our discussion this evening could not come at a more timely moment, and it's not just because June is Pride Month. The events of the last month have brought horrifying renewed focus on the Black Lives Matter movement and its broad frame of racial justice. Nothing can lighten that experience, but the two Supreme Court decisions in the last couple of weeks have helped provide some context. The first decision affirms protections against workplace discrimination for LGBT individuals. That was quickly followed by the procedural pause on the Trump administration's intent to withdraw DACA protections. Both these Supreme Court decisions are welcome setbacks to the Trump administration because, of course, this is the same administration whose mishandling of the COVID has led to disproportionate impacts on Black and Brown communities across the country and whose Department of Health and Services has removed protections for transgender patients from discrimination. The importance of having a space that offers community, belonging, connection, and safety, as well as many other things, is more important now than ever. This topic is of special resonance for MAS because as part of our future vision for New York City, we are turning our attention to the importance of protecting the city's enduring culture. All We've Got provides important lessons about that quest, and we are hopeful our discussion this evening points us in some key directions. We are delighted to have two fabulous panelists with us this evening. The first is Alexis Clements, director and producer of All We've Got. Alexis is a writer and filmmaker based in Brooklyn, New York. Her creative work has been published, produced, and screened in venues across the United States, Europe, and South America. Her feature-length documentary, All We've Got, premiered last fall in New York City and has since been screened all over the country and internationally. A regular contributor to Hyperallergic, her work has also appeared in the Los Angeles Review of Books, The Guardian, Bitch Magazine, American Theater, the Brooklyn Rail, and Nature, among others. In addition to her writing and her filmmaking, she is currently serving on the Executive Board of the Center for LGBT Studies at CUNY, and she has recently co-founded Little Rainbows, a story time for queer youth and their caretakers and parents at the Lesbian Herstory Archives. We're also joined by Shawn Smith-Cruz, who is featured in All We've Got. Shawn is an archivist at the Lesbian Herstory Archive, an assistant curator and associate dean for teaching, learning, and engagement at New York University, Division of Libraries, and she is the co-chair for the board of CLAGS and chair of the Archives Committee. Shawn was a collective member of Wow Cafe Theater for over 10 years, co-producing Rivers of Honey, a cabaret for women of color. Shawn has a BA in Queer Women's Studies from CUNY's Baccalaureate Program, an MFA in Creative Writing and Fiction, and an MLS with a focus on archiving and records management from Queens College. Thank you both for joining us this evening. We are thrilled to have you. We are thrilled to be able to discuss All We've Got and your roles in it, but also thank you for your leadership in all the institutions that you have provided such fabulous leadership for. Hello. So let's dive into that conversation. May I start with you, Alexis?
Yes.
in the film, you talk directly about what motivated you to make All We've Got, and I was wondering if you could elaborate a little bit about that to start the discussion this evening.
Absolutely, yeah. There's at one point when I was on the road with the cinematographer and the production assistant, Sarah and Jeanette, we were trying to go through this, and in fact, there's about 15 different motivations that led me to make the film. But the sort of quick answer is that I was involved with the Lesbian Herstory Archives on and off for a couple of years before this process started, and I was really moved by being in part of that space, and also really clear that that was a very different space than the kinds of spaces that I was hearing about in the press when people talked about queer spaces. And one of the things that in particular around that time was that there were a lot of stories about lesbian bars closing. And that narrative took a very particular arc. But I knew that places like the archives were still open, and I knew that they didn't get the same headlines. The headlines tend to focus on the things we've lost. And so I was really interested when I went on the road in understanding how spaces like the archives have managed to survive when the story that we so often hear is about queer spaces that have closed. And so that question of why do these spaces manage to stick around when so many others don't was really a big part of my curiosity in asking questions in each of these spaces and trying to understand what made them different than other spaces.
Well, that's a great transition to the question that I really wanted to start with you, Shawn, and that was to talk a little bit about the fact that the film obviously speaks to the fact that the Lesbian Herstory Archives is the only building ever owned by and for lesbians in New York City metropolitan area. It's a little shocking to hear that, actually. Can you share more about how the space offers community and the importance of representation and ownership in terms of documenting and preserving and sharing her story?
Yes, I can.
Great.
Thank you for having me. I have to say it's an honor to be speaking on behalf of the Lesbian Herstory Archives with Alexis, who, may I disclose, has just recently joined the coordinating committee at the Lesbian Herstory Archives. So
Indeed.
We've got her now. Finally, so we've been like a decade, if not more, that we've been pulling her in. So part of the wonder and beauty of the Lesbian Herstory Archives is that it is a collectively run, community-run space. And so that means that, you know, my one voice is speaking with the voices of lesbians from across the world, because it's been really a labor of love and true collaboration. And at the same time, you know, as we think about issues of space, well, as we're all here in this virtual space, right, and not in real space, we're mourning the loss of the building. Not the loss of the actual building. The building still stands, but we can't really engage with the building as we had prior to COVID pushing us back into our homes. So with that in mind, we have been having conversations around, you know, what does the space mean to us, and how do we exist as a collective, and how do we process collections? How do we think about the space now that we don't have access to the physical materials or the actual location? And it really has brought us to, well, what are our values, right? What are our principles? What do we need to be doing in this time? And how does that matter to the rest of the community who is sort of waiting for us to give them feedback on what's next and how they can still engage with the organization? I guess I can go ahead and say that one way that we're aware that can happen is through virtual space. And so we have been already working at this rate for 2 years on developing our new website. And so we kind of had more time to do it now that we weren't working on the collections directly. And so we're putting that online. It should launch within a few days. So you can go to the website and refresh your page, and sometime between now and next week, it'll air, you know, for Pride. But I mean, beyond that, having our collections accessible digitally is something that we're always moving toward and have been in process of doing. So we have a few digitization projects that have been ongoing, one of which has been really advantageous to the organization in that it has allowed for our sustainability in some ways financially. because it was the scanning of our subject files, which I know now I'm getting into the weeds, but it's sort of the files that are the lesbian and what. So like if you just put a blank line there, you can add a word, lesbians and motherhood, lesbians and religion, or something specific, lesbians and media. You can find a file for that. And it'll lead you to other parts of the collection. And so we've scanned those, and those are accessible through a vendor that is paying us royalties for it. So that's an example of how putting material out into the community, into the world in a greater scale can also help to sustain the physical existence of the organization. I know that was a roundabout answer, but hopefully it answered your question. And
no, really helpful. And I guess it's so interesting to think about, this experience that we're all having about living in the virtual world in a way. But I think the power of the film in some ways is to talk about both, sort of ends of the spectrum, the ownership model that is her story, as well as, you also highlight, Alexis, the whole other end where people, the trans picnic is happening totally separate from any space. It's an ownership of space for a moment in a public place. And I'm just curious whether you two can talk a little bit about the differences between, assuming we're getting past this and that we're moving back into physical places, the difference between those experiences and why people chose different approaches.
Well, I'll just address it quickly, and then I'll hand it over to Shawn. I think that, one of the questions that I think inevitably comes up in this particular moment, which certainly we hope that we will move through, but certainly the future will look different as a result of where we are today. But in thinking about virtual community and what it means to share space virtually versus physically, which I think in some way the film begs a little bit that question. One of the things that really, so I'm going to take a little bit of a brief tangent, but I was a military brat when I was a kid. So that means that my dad was drafted and we moved around a lot as a family. And also then I was changing schools a lot as a young person. And so community was really just this theoretical thing that I was vaguely aware of. And I had some sense of how people use that word. But my lived experience of it I had no lived experience of it in a really practical, felt like emotional and physical sense. And the archives was the first time that I had that sensibility. And making the film was really part of what led me to make the film on a very personal level, was trying to understand what community is, because I had such a detached sense of what that meant. And I'm telling this story to say that one of the things that this film taught me, is that community, for me anyway, after making this film, is really about having shared goals and shared purpose. And working together, because that builds accountability. Like, you want to stick around in the room even when you disagree with people, because you want to get that thing that you were there to done. Like, you're willing to work through the difficulty and pain because it's like, I care enough about this thing that I want to keep moving, even if it's difficult. And so I'm saying that to say that I think that those two models that you mentioned, like a place like the archives versus the trans ladies picnics, which, is a really interesting model because they do rely on physical space. They rely on a public common, right? Which is a whole other conversation. But if there's no public space, there is no trans ladies picnics, because the whole point of that picnic, Red has a lot of principles and sort of ideas that underpinned it. And it's very clearly predicated on a sort of anarchist value of making it impossible to own, in fact. And so there is a necessity of physical space, but it operates in a totally different way than ownership. And I think that on like a level of, we could really get into this, and I want to hand it to Shawn, but there is actually, that's a big question I think underpins the film, because all of the spaces that have survived that are physical spaces are owned in some way. The spaces that have not survived, by and large, don't survive because of rent pressures and gentrification. We can get into that. But ownership is both something that people with a lot of resource can do, and it's limited in some way. But at the same time, ownership models, there are a lot of people thinking about ownership models in a very different way. And the archives is an amazing example of that, where, donations as small as $5 contributed to the ownership of that building. So it's a kind of reclaiming and insistence on holding space that is not the same as what we're used to thinking about when we think about ownership. So I'll just open that huge topic. I'm curious what Shawn...
jump in here.
Yeah,
I want to jump in on that, just pull right from that moment of, what is ownership and where does it land in these organizations? And just to speak from both the Lesbian Herstory Archives and Wild Cafe Theater, which I've been a part of as well, part of what people are owning is the mission of the organization, like Alexis mentions, the purpose and the collective purpose, but even more so, they own the agency within the organization. So before, the first meeting that you walk into in a WOW meeting, is you come in on a Tuesday night when they have their collective meetings, you have an equal vote to whatever decision is being made in that meeting. And that has been the mission or the principles or the purpose or the structure since its beginning. And so that has moved through groups of people, the same people who had been there 20 years ago aren't there now, but that collective understanding of how they operate and who's able to make choices and decisions remains, and it's collectively run. So to me, that's the most important part, is that you can come without experience or without, like, every place from whence you come adds to your expertise. And so if you're someone who comes in for the first time, you come in with expertise because you're seeing it with brand new eyes, and you can offer something that everyone else is blind to, right? Like, you can offer that perspective. And so you can then arrange for new ideas you can own the ideas that you have, and you can bring them to the space and make the space grow. Similarly with LHA, it's intergenerational, and someone who, the theory behind that is anybody can offer their expertise and own a project. Oh no, of course my daughter has to use the bathroom right now. But I'll just say that I'm gonna have to bring her. Having ownership of the mission and really contributing to it in a way that allows you to own your process. And I'm going to give an example of that. Rivers of Honey, which was a women of color theater space, it was the first Friday of every month for over 10 years. And when it started, part of the reason why I was able to do that was because we decided that Rivers would get a special sort of accommodation as a result of the lack of women of color that had been in the space up until that point for a large chunk of time. And so that accommodation was that all of the producers of the shows did not have to come to the collective meeting. They didn't even have to join the collective. There just has to be a representative. So like a proxy would be there for anyone. So I could produce a show in March, but I wouldn't have had to come to the February meeting. Someone would come for me, right? And what that allowed for was for women who felt that space was not theirs, they didn't own it because of the lack of women of color within the space. It allowed for a bridging of communities. And over time, what that created was the highest produced show, the show with the largest audience. The first show I produced had, if you know WOW, it's on West 4th between Bowery and 2nd Avenue. It had a line that went around 2nd Avenue to 3rd Street, right? So, or 5th Street, whatever's north, so 5th. And it was huge. I mean, we had to turn away over 100 women. And so that kind of buy-in and interest, because of suddenly the ownership of the community in that space, really transformed the space so that at a certain point it was a majority women of color, it may still be majority of women of color who were running WOW. And I think that was a part of that idea of ownership, of the philosophy, of the building, of the space. So I'll stop there, and I'm going to run to say my daughter. I'm just going to bring you with me, and then I'll have my camera up. I'm so sorry.
Okay, there we go. This will be an unusual experience. Alexis, I wanted to talk to you a little bit. This gives me a wonderful transition to talk to you about some of the other spaces that you looked at. I was very moved by
Esperanza Center. Yeah.
Thank you. Sorry, I would of course trip over that. Peace and Justice Center, because first of all, it's a very vibrant space, and it's wonderful to see it and experience it a little bit vicariously. But I also thought it was interesting because they were using every tool they could find, right? They had ownership, they had community protests, they had activism, they had lawsuits. And I'm just interested in knowing whether, I hope that other institutions don't have that much challenge, but I'm curious about what your observation was talking to them and getting to know them in depth about how those things knitted together and how it actually led to a more durable institution.
Yeah, I think that I will say that every organization in the film is organization's not the right word, right? Because it's a little more complex than that. But every group in the film engages in political activity, engages in perhaps not like lawsuits or something, but I will say that some of the tactics that we see in the Esperanza Center are tactics that other organizations that are in the film use because participating in space is an opportunity to build political voice, right? It's a chance to be together with people, even if you may not have intended to go there with politics in mind. It is actually integrated and built into the structure of these organizations because of how they're formed. So that sense of using many tactics and having many efforts and many things going on is actually common to all of these groups or spaces. The Esperanza is kind of probably, to your point, using every available tactic because they are engaged in such broad-based work. They are, I take a lot of inspiration from Graciela Sanchez's. There's a moment in the film where she talks about the inspiration for this space, and she talks about the queer women of color who inspired the Esperanza, right? Like Barbara Smith and Gloria Anzaldúa and Audre Lorde, and these figures who made a point of refusing to be single issue or refusing to limit their activities to one aspect of themselves. And so in the work of the Esperanza, you see that taking the form of any issue that impacts their community is an issue that the Esperanza is engaged in. So in a way, their political commitments necessitate a diversity of tactics and necessitate this sort of like omni approach. So I'm trying to think if I'm answering your question, but I think it's hard to even imagine all the because they've been around now for 30 years, so it would be hard to even quantify. But in terms of holding space, yeah, definitely, it's really about ownership. They got kicked out of, I can't remember if it's in the film or not, but they got kicked out of a couple of their earlier spaces precisely because of the fact that they were censoring queer work. They were located in a space that was owned by the Catholic Church early on, and that became a problem for the Catholic Church at a certain point, and they were, their lease was not renewed. And then later, another space that they were involved in, as I understand it, there was something that unfortunately they have continued to experience over the years, which is conflict among white gay men. Well, conflict's the wrong way to put it, but essentially a sort of pressure from Christian white gay men who were not thrilled with the kinds of politics that the Esperanza was engaged in. And that was part of the pressure that was put on them over the years as well. So ownership became a survival tactic in a very blunt way. Like they learned the lesson the hard way more than once.
Yeah. Thank you. That's really helpful. And Shawn, I really want to go back to you because talking about these multiple tactics, as you were talking about the Wow Cafe, and as I was watching the film, the role of, I was struck by two things. I'm interested in hearing you talk about the relationship between art and creativity and activism. And also, you touched on this a little bit just in your previous comments, about the sort of regularity, the regularity of meeting and opportunities for coming in and out of the space that helped people feel that community. So I'm sorry, that's kind of two different questions, but I'll let you take it in whichever order you'd like.
I think that it bridges me to the answer a bit because, and maybe it's also Alexis's recent remark on the Catholic Church, but I would say that one way that I think Rivers was successful, Rivers, I think, was part of a cabaret weekend. So every show would have a 3-week run, and then there would be a weekend of sort of crossover, moving the sets and reinstalling the next one. And so that weekend we would just have the one-off shows, which would be a cabaret weekend. So Rivers was on Friday, then there was a burlesque show on Saturday, and this went on for about a decade or more. Let's just say a decade, keep it round. And one thing that Rivers offered to that space was a spiritual connection. And so it was an art space, and it was about performance. But one thing that we made sure that we had was an altar, and in that altar, you had a different Orisha who we dedicated the space to, and so it was usually Oshun, but in the last 3 or so years, when we had conflicts of ownership of the space, we expanded the Orisha from Oshun to also Yemenya, Ogun to Abatla. We included male Orishas as well as female Orishas, communal embodied, male embodied. And so I think that what that did was it really bridged people on an emotional, spiritual, larger than themselves kind of level, and it really gave them. I mean, it felt ritualized. So the regularity became a ritual, and the prayer, if you will, which was the art, which was the calling to. We actually had an altar goddess who would invite the altar and us to the space, and we would lock hands and encircle the space. And we would call to our ancestors in the space. And so that energy that was built, in ritual, I think really activated people, right? So whether it was an activist experience, we could debate what that would mean, but I think it definitely activated people to the point where I still remember one show, a woman who would come all the time. And, if it was almost so that if she didn't come, we'd wonder if she was okay. Like she didn't have any internet. She didn't have any electronic devices. She was very particular, but she was there in clockwork, and we stopped seeing her. And then she returned, and she came and she said, I have something I need to say. And we had this moment at the beginning of most shows where people could do sort of an open mic before the featured performers. And she came to the stage and said that she had just come from Ghana. She'd done a journey to Africa and had returned, and all of the things that she had learned as she was there, and she talks about what those things were. She said that she had to bring it back home to the community, and she understood for herself that the community was this space, and that meant coming to that moment in that experience and that stage and speaking to the people in the room. And so there was something about her professing that so directly. And so, I mean, I never heard the woman's voice. She wouldn't speak to any, she was but she was a serious person. And there was a breakthrough. There was a transformation for other people. Just to grab for one more, because I'm like recalling all these moments. I remember when Stacey Ann Chin was she's a poet who had also done a play of, she wrote a memoir about her upbringing in Jamaica, and then she did a play that was produced by a woman who was on Sex and the City, which is horrible because she's a person with a name, and I don't remember what the name is, but that's fine. So it was widely produced, right? So she was coming during her first round of her book release, and that might have been the 100 people had to get turned away because it was Stacey Ann Chin. So really, it was all her. But we packed the room. It only has a capacity of 60. I can say this now because it's too late for anybody to get in trouble. We packed the room to about 300 people. So there were rows of seats on the floor, the sides, the back. I mean, it was a cocoon, right? It was a womb. And in the center was Stacey Ann. If you've ever seen her perform, she's large she's small-bodied, large voice, accented, bold, animated. I mean, she's like a Jamaican woman's grandma, but in, with a tight, bodice shirt on, cursing, right? And so she's professing this experience of her rape and her, the moment where she, in the book, described when she realized it was not her fault, and she just screamed over and over, "It was not my fault." I mean, the room was heaving. People were in tears. I mean, it was just with the altar in the background, with the heat, because it was in the summer. We didn't have air conditioning, and all of these women of color just really, that's what I mean by activated, right? Like there was no turning back from that moment, and it was so alive. And so afterward, you know, the kind of relationships that would be built from that, the kind of art that would come from that kind of space where people knew it would happen again and again, and that the theater was a venue for which they could promote their art and, you know, workshop it and produce by coming to one meeting. I mean, it really, it's unlike any other theater space in the city where you have to be a member or sign it, create an application. I don't even know what people have to do actually to get into the theaters in the city, but it's not as simple as walk in and you know, put your name on the calendar, literally write your name in pencil on this paper calendar. And so that is, to me, and it's a revolutionary act that it existed for as long as it did, and it still does. Although, again, not right now in terms of whether we can access it. Fourth Arts Block. Okay, fine. Fourth Arts Block is what WOW is a part of. But I didn't even get to read the chat. But yes, there's so many. Yes, WOW was, I think, a part of the Fourth Arts Block. So exactly, yes. But that hopefully that answers the question about how art and activism can interrelate. And also, I'll add one more point, is that at the Lesbian Herstory Archives, we have something called At Homes. We also have performances, and we also have events and one-off kind of big time events where artists come in and promote their work, and it has the same kind of effect because of the community that the Lesbian Herstory Archives has. It has sort of access to a huge lesbian network of women, and so whenever anything that is artistically sound is occurring, people really do come and they do kind of generate that same sort of activation.
Well, it also sounds like in both spaces that women are able to be their authentic selves and bond together out of that authentic self. I thought some of the comments in the film, Alexis, that you captured were really moving about that sort of sub-theme of it. So maybe we could just talk a little bit about obviously because of the WOW Cafe and the Lesbian Archives, we've been talking a lot about New York, and we'll certainly come back. But I'm just curious about why, Alexis, you decided to focus on not so much on the left and right coasts, as we sometimes refer to them, and why you decided to dig in more in the center of the country, and what you found from that you think would have been different if you had been focused in the sort of places that I think people think of as being more hospitable, which they may or may not be, but they may think they are.
Yeah, the simple answer to that is that I didn't know those stories very well because I wasn't reading them. So that to the same extent that part of what motivated me to make the film was that I wasn't reading stories about spaces like the archives, the other piece of it was that I wasn't reading stories about spaces that were outside of the coasts, right? We hear a lot about LGBTQ communities in New York and San Francisco, and sometimes we get a little taste of other cities, but there's, two sort of like heavy weights on either side of the country. So for me, it was motivated by a similar curiosity. Like, I know that there's queer people everywhere in every state. And so why aren't we hearing that? So that was the motivation. And then in terms of lessons learned, it was just, the two spaces that we see in the film that really demonstrate it most clearly are the Esperanza and the Alibis Bar in Oklahoma. I did visit more spaces than that, but it got into how specific queer communities are in different regions, that we just can't take things for granted. We can't assume that these stories we hear about the coasts are in any way translatable, right? Even San Francisco to New York, those worlds are pretty different. The norms in those cities, the way they function, and the norms of the queer communities that exist within them. And right, it's queer communities, plural. There is no such thing as the LGBTQ community. There's no such thing as the lesbian community. There are people who identify in that way, who participate in very particular communities. So yeah, the lessons there were just how to just be very mindful of that, to be very mindful of not making assumptions and not, because in some way, some of the work that is being done in spaces like the Esperanza in San Antonio and being done in Oklahoma, it has its own kind of radicality in a way that you can't be radical in the same way in a place like New York because of that presumed progressiveness, that presumed sort of liberal environment. Yeah, I found those spaces incredibly inspiring, and I learned so much in being exposed to them because they operate so differently.
And I want to thank you both for talking a little bit about, I think one of the things that's inspiring about the film is the fact that we're not just talking about bars, right? That is a common sort of spot where people first find a community, but it's these deeper places, right, where people are connecting in all parts of themselves. I think, Shawn, you said that is really, those were moving stories to hear and to see and to think about how they are reflected in other kinds of communities as well, right? That's the thing that makes places feel unique and unusual. It shouldn't be the same in all these places. And so all these deeper institutions that you talked about are all different from each other too, right? Which is fabulous. It's life.
And I wanted to say, I think that's also why it's important for LHA that it's about every lesbian and it's about lesbians from not just New York City, even though that's where the place is based, but really thinking about who the world of lesbians, what the world of lesbians looks like, and highlighting multiple groups of people. And we would often get people who were traveling from, whenever people were traveling internationally, they would definitely come, and it would be like they were on an, paying homage to this space, and they had, have finally come home to this, whenever I hear come home, I think of the Michigan Women's Music Festival, which I would go to often. And I would say, welcome home, as they would come in. And it really did mean that, like, the ownership in the space was located in that one particular location, but it was home to many people. And I think that goes back to that idea of ownership and who owns locations.
I'm curious whether both of you could speak. I thought both the film, but also some of the portrayals of obviously the community around the Lesbian Herstory Archives spoke to some roots in the 60s that were also about feminism too, obviously. And I was just curious, the film obviously talks about those moments of activism and how they relate to today. But I'm just curious whether either of you have observations about that connectedness or its not connectedness, to the extent that it has influenced, the 60s and 70s have influenced the institutions that you both lead and have observed, or not.
I'll just say briefly that one of the points that the film raises is that the spaces that have survived are also intergenerational. And so what that means, so basically in terms of the physical spaces featured in the film, so setting the trans ladies picnics to the side for a moment, in terms of the physical spaces, by and large, those are coming out of activism in the 70s and the 80s. That sort of, has the history that came out of the 60s, but in terms of the creation of those spaces, that's happening in the 70s and 80s, in the context of a lot of radical activism, and very particularly in the context of lesbian feminism and the formation and sort of like realization of lesbian feminist goals. what's interesting about those spaces today, these ones in the film, the ones that have survived, and that point about intergenerational participation, is that, their politics change, people change, the world changes. And so finding a way to create a gracious enough understanding of that politic to allow for the fact that people will change. One of the things that I love in the film, there's a conversation at the archives about difference within the community, right? This point about there is no such thing as the lesbian community. There never was such a thing, right? That's the great thing about it, in the sense that there was never an agreement about what exactly we mean when we say that, or what exactly, what those commitments are, or who that person looks like. That was not true in the 70s. It wasn't true in the 80s. It's not true today. And the amazing thing about the politic that exists at the archives in particular, I'll just pick on that because it is so focused on history, but manages to be in the contemporary space, is that the principles and their vision to include, as Shawn put it very well, it's about every lesbian. It's about anybody who uses that word to identify. They were never prescriptive, right? They wanted to create space. They wanted to have this history, but it was never prescriptive. And so there's lots of different ways to realize the politics of the 60s and 70s, but that particular realization of it has allowed the powerful legacies to carry forward in a way that I think is very unique. And it could be a lesson for a lot of political movements that want to be gracious enough to shift with time.
Are there thoughts that you want to add?
I'm sorry, I didn't realize my mic was on the entire time. It's super disruptive. I was talking to my kid. I think that what I would add to that would be and this is more tangible, the consciousness raising circle, the consciousness raising group, the idea of intersectionality that to me really stems from this consideration of really digging deeper into the multiple layers of who we are and acknowledging all of those parts of ourselves in the creation of the spaces that we're developing. And I know it didn't be, the circle is, it existed between many tribes throughout time, right? But I think just the behavioral nature, the woo of these spaces were from the 60s and 70s, and you can not have ever entered WOW or LHA, but if you had been to a similar kind of group that was collectively run and had certain ways of communicating, you would be able to just merge right in because the behaviors are very similar. And I think that is what allows for the intergenerationality, the diversity of people in the space, different races, and just people coming from multiple walks of life and wanting to ensure that that's still a part of the way that the spaces are run. I think when you lose that, which sometimes that happens, sometimes what I found being a part of both WOW and LHA for over 10 years each, sometimes you lose a segment of diversity, whatever that may be. Everybody in here is the same age. Everyone in here is the same race. Everyone in here has a college degree. Suddenly, you notice the shift in how programming works, and you notice that there's a level of stagnation, and the growth sort of dissipates, and it becomes a very different kind of organization. And I think that that's often when rifts begin and shifts need to happen so that we can reintegrate into the who we are, right? But that's okay because we have these built-in systems that I think do come from the fact that it existed as long as it had. And maybe there's just some assuredness in that timing. We've been around forever. We're not going to go anywhere. It'll be fine. Could be the attitude, but I think the attitude is also, well, we've seen this before and we know how to get through it. And part of it is that we're not upholding some part of our core values, and we need to identify that and reach back to that to keep going.
Yes, I imagined as you were both talking about this that there were probably some moments of real conflict, but being able to sort through that and learning how to sort through that, right, is absolutely essential. You can't, if you just walk away from it, then it just lays there. So I'm going to call. I think I'm going to turn the conversation a little bit I want to call on Tara Kelly, who had a question about the archive and about its place in a historic district and in a historic building. Tara?
Hi. Yes. So thanks so much. I put a question into the chat. I believe, if I'm looking at the boundaries correctly, that the LHA is located within the historic district in Park Slope, which was designated in 1973. And from what I know about other historic districts, that doesn't necessarily mean that its full story and importance to the community is necessarily, explained in the designation report or one of the things that is celebrated and understood by the Landmarks Commission, which is the overseeing body. And more recently, sites like Stonewall and Julius's Bar within the Village Historic District have been recognized independently as individual landmarks for their very purpose and use in the history of LGBTQ history. So I was wondering if LHA would be interested in pursuing something like that, or perhaps amending the designation report to more clearly highlight this really important role that it plays within the community that is so much broader than just Park Slope to New York City, nationally, internationally, as Shawn had mentioned, with sort of pilgrimages to the site. Is that something that's important? On the flip side, that isn't something that's going to protect the use of the building, of the space. It's really about the architecture and ornament outside. But what are the other ways that potentially New York City could serve to better protect and promote these really important community spaces?
I could start with that. Yeah. I guess I'll start by saying thank you for the question. It definitely came up a million times last year when there was Stonewall 50 and the archives was asked to be on 5 panels a day. So I'm trying to pull back from those moments and those conversations to get some facts right, but I'm going to get them wrong because I haven't thought of it in a while. But I will say that when LHA chose the location and chose the building, it wasn't the same Park Slope that it is today. And although there was it was known to be Park Slope, it wasn't the shiny and pristine Park Slope that we know now. It was affordable then, and it was kind of where other people who could afford to live in places that are affordable lived, and it was closer to the community as a result of that. So it was just really, it could have easily, I wouldn't say it could have been Brownsville, but it could have been in a different part of Brooklyn, right? But it just happened to be in Dyke Slopes, as we like to call it, and maybe had something to do with that. It was all part of that same growth of the community. And having said that, one of the primary principles of LHA is that we do not want or receive any government support. And so that's an important part of our mission, because we do not want to be beholden to their sudden requests for alteration or any kind of reintegration of our purpose and our mission and our principles based on our obligation to them as a result of their funding. And so really, the conversation of how can New York City support places like the archives is a complicated one, right? Because we expect that we pay our taxes, and so things are going to fall in line. They're going to pick up our garbage. There are ways that the space will be serviced as a result of that, of where we're located. But we also do not want to. We don't want to come into a position where we're reliant on, if not beholden to, the city. So I think there may be different ways to brainstorm what support could look like and how we could work together. one of those ways could be a designation, and it has been the case that there's been an approach request, and I think it may have been a local historic site as opposed to a national historic site, for example. But I'm not actually, I don't have, if I had known, I would have went in my email and found the name of the designation. But there had been a lot of conversation on the designation and something sent to us with, official status, and everyone was just kind of like, oh, that's nice. And then we moved on with we went back to the folder. Because in some ways, we are the ones who've done that already, right? Like, we've created the landmark status on behalf of lesbians for ourselves, and we are definitely not looking for the approval of the man to say that we are designated officially, an official historic site, because the lesbian community already knows it to be true. Having said that, I don't think we're at a place where we would say no to it or disagree, but we're also aware of how much of this is sort of the movement of people that have nothing to do with the organization, right? So it often would be someone who, like, there was a funding stream that moved this along, right? Like, there were people who were hired to participate in a project that will have an end date. Like, it was about the structure of politics and not about the work that had been done for 40 years. So we're aware of the dynamics that it implies, and we don't want to get caught up in that or deter or take away from our work to appease that process. But we wouldn't necessarily shy away from it, but it's just not necessarily a focus. But Alexis, you were around when this is all happening, so you might have a different memory and say something completely opposite. So I'll let you mention it.
Well, I think that I wasn't part of any of those conversations, so I think I'll leave it mostly with what you're saying. But I think Shawn's perspective offers that sort of, like, in a way, I think that, right, like, it begs the question of what is the form of the actual support and what are the strings attached? And, like, what does it mean to actually, what these spaces provide is for community autonomy. And that ownership provides autonomy. And that's true of all of these spaces, right? Like, that's very important to the work that the Esperanza is doing. As I said, they got kicked out twice, and that was a very clear, like, kick in the butt to autonomy. And so city support for, I think, any marginalized community, or, however we want to define that, but communities that are underrepresented in real estate, let's maybe put it that way, has to find ways to build in respect for that autonomy and give space for that autonomy if the objective is for those communities to really to have the kind of ritualized invitation that Shawn was talking about earlier, right? To feel safe in coming back, to feel safe that this really is my space. It's not like de Blasio's, like, Pride initiative this month, right? Because that's going to go away. So it is a bigger sort of philosophical question than just, it's about that autonomy. How can you help communities maintain their own autonomy?
Sorry. Now I need to unmic. I wanted to add something to this because I think it's relevant to what you're describing, which is sort of the intersection of regulation and, to both of your points, the autonomy of the mission of these institutions. I think, as MAS has begun to think about these things, the dynamics of real estate in New York are so, at least until March, right, were so hot that if you couldn't achieve ownership, that did threaten, places. It does threaten all kinds of places, right, from mom and pop retail locations to institutions of community. Just the ability to tell stories, the complex stories that New York is a home to. And so I guess I'm curious, whether there are other things that you think are important that are about recognition of that autonomy and recognition of those stories. Because I think, New York is caught in this right now, and we're talking about monuments again. This is a very important question about what stories do we represent in our public spaces, and how do we make sure that the stories that are embedded there actually stay alive and keep getting told. So historic preservation is one kind of tool that's been around for a long time, right, which is about the bricks and mortar part of this. But you all are talking very powerfully about the herstory, the other parts of the dynamic of these long stories of community and how we protect them and talk about them. So I'm just curious whether you have advice to all of us who sort of, this is our day job, right? This is what we think about, and we want to think about this more, certainly in MAS and in our community. This is very much a question. Do you have any advice for us about things either that came out of the film for you in other places, or just your own experience as residents of New York and thinking about these problems yourself from other aspects of your life that we should be thinking about?
Do you want to go? Okay, I'll start. I think that for me, it's impossible to have made this film and not be thinking about what the conditions were that allowed for WOW to pay $1 to hold their space. And I know that we can't go back, right? We can't go back to the past. We're in the present. But we give tax breaks. We give enough money to the people who have money to cover the costs of buying buildings that are disused, that are underused, that are in bad condition. There's a lot of city-owned property that is not very well used, if at all. And we have an interesting moment now where I think we all can recognize that commercial real estate is going to look very different next year than it did this year. And that presents a lot of opportunities. There's a lot of space in this city. I'm not enough of a data nerd to know, but I know that a lot of the towers that are being built, even before the pandemic, were less than half occupied. I don't know, if that would be true into the future, but I think that there is an abundance and there is an underutilization of that abundance, and where the money is being put could be reallocated. It's really just it's not that simple, but it is that simple. And pathways to ownership for people who are underrepresented in ownership, I think, remains the only way to support the kind of autonomy that we see in the spaces in this film. And I just don't see any half measure. But that's sort of my perspective making the film. I just don't, I don't know that any kind of lease, because I work, my day job is in a building in Lower Manhattan, and there were a lot of artists. I write a lot about the arts in my life outside of this, and there are a lot of arts organizations that were made use of, right, in a very deliberate way. We want to bring life back to Lower Manhattan after September 11. We're going to write these incredibly favorable leases, but they have a termination date. And those spaces went out of business. I know at least one of them near my office went bankrupt because they couldn't cover the lease when the lease went back to market rates. So again, people are being used in certain ways in real estate, in the real estate game. And that gives truth to the lie that there is not available space. They just want to use that space in a very particular way to turn up the volume on somebody else later. And I think that that's BS. And I think it reveals that those people could have been given ownership. There could have been a pathway to a different form of using those organizations. I'll leave it there. I could go on. You're muted, Elizabeth.
Thank you all for keeping me covered here. We are getting close to the close of our hour here. Shawn, I'd be delighted to have any additional comments that you wanted to make now, or if there's things you want to share in closing, I would love to have those.
Well, I guess I can close. It's not really a closing statement, but I wanted to say a little bit about that, which was in 2016, I was invited to St. Paul, Minnesota or maybe it was Minneapolis. No, St. Paul, to talk about race-based and arts organizations with a group called Common Ground. And part of the conversation that we had there was about this idea that these two communities were being gentrified, and how do we deal with race and gentrification? How do we deal with being artists and gentrification? Which side of the line are we on? And really grappling through those questions of being whole, doing what you love in a community and space, wanting to do it in affordable places, knowing that it's pushing people out of the spaces that they're in, and how to come to terms with that. And I think that is, interestingly, that those conversations were happening in Minnesota. And then, now that Minnesota has sparked a national or international movement, because that really is the center of the conversation. It's about who's where and why. And until we really dig into the depth of the fact that, race is the redlining from the beginning of, since we're talking about the 60s, until now has really shaped American culture, and we were listing places where we are located right now. And, I was from Brownsville and Flatbush, and I can't afford to live there now, yet I can because I bought a house, but I had to come to Connecticut. Why am I in Connecticut? Who did I push out in Connecticut, et cetera? Or who left for me to get here? And, is my property value going down or up because of my presence? All of these conversations are what we have to think about when we're thinking about the locations for which we're experiencing our lives. And until we figure out ways to negotiate and manage and strategize around racial lived space, then we can't really address any of the other questions. So I would end there by asking us to start there, right? To think about who is your neighbor, what do they look like, and what is the makeup of the group in which we live in, or the community in which we live in. And as someone I didn't see a white person until I was in high school. Well, that's not true. My teachers, anyway, I went to private school. There were black teachers, but et cetera. There were no white people in my community when I grew up in Flatbush, Brooklyn. Now there are only white people in Flatbush, Brooklyn. Not only, but you get my point. Why is that, and what does that say about the organizations, the business we frequent, anything about who we are and what we do, and how does that bleed into our work and our art, and what are the spaces that we want to see? So I think that is probably not the question you're asking, but to me that's the answer to the question.
It is absolutely perfect. I think your point was it's the start of the conversation. Alexis, do you have things you'd like to add as we close?
No, I think that was a great place to finish the beginning.
Right, exactly. Well, I can't thank you both enough for taking time to join us tonight to have this conversation. It was really fun for me. I hope it was fun for you too, and for our audience. And thank you again for all your extraordinary leadership and all the things that you're doing from your art to your institution building. We are very grateful. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you so much for having us.
Thank you for allowing my daughter.
We're delighted to have her. Take care. Good night, everyone.
Bye-bye.